My name is Kelly Pollack. I'm the Associate Dean of Students in the Division of Social Sciences. And one of my charges is fellowships. So this is an area that I know pretty well. But I'm also on a team that's starting a new initiative in the division. And the initiative is called the Emerging Leaders Initiative. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about this initiative. It's designed for doctoral students in the social sciences. I know not all of you are doctoral students in the social sciences. We're going to have a lot of programming, and as much as possible, we want to open it up so that other people can learn the types of things that we're talking about too. But the initiative itself is designed for the doctoral students. So just wanted to tell you what the concrete aims of the program, of the initiative are. So we're looking to improve the lives of graduate students, which I think you can all agree with. To supplement the academic education that you receive in your departments with opportunities for professional development, personal development, so helping out with that at a divisional level. And to better prepare our students to finish on time and with the most productive years ahead of them. So those are the overall aims of this initiative. And this is something we're just rolling out now. We're just getting it off the ground. We're going to be, for any of you who are doctoral students in the social sciences, you're going to be getting a survey pretty soon. So we want to get sort of a feel for what's going on with our doctoral students and how we can help improve their lives, what we should do with this initiative. So part of this initiative is something we're calling the Leadership Lab. And so the Leadership Lab is going to be a series of workshops and panel discussions and things like this that are really designed to do these sorts of things that I'm talking about, especially sort of round out your experience in terms of professional development and personal development. And so this is the first event in the series. You should keep your eyes open. We plan to have another event this quarter on striking a work-life balance. Then there'll be another series of events in winter and spring. But this event, first one, we're calling this Focus Your Future Through Fellowship Applications. And this is an area, like I said, fellowships is something that I know pretty well, but I also think it's something that's really important and often not as well understood as it could be. So to kick things off, we have Katie Kinsler here. She is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Psychology here in our Department of Psychology, and she's going to speak to us, and then we'll have a panel who will come up to the front. And then at the very end, I'll wrap up with a few sort of hints and tips on fellowship applications.
Yeah, I'll just do it. That's fine. Thanks so much. Okay, yes, I'm Katie Kinsler. This is my 6th year as an assistant professor here in the psychology department. Just so I can have a sense of who you guys are, so how many of you are PhD students in the division? Okay, so is anybody not? Is anybody something else? What are you guys? You are? Okay, that's okay. Okay, great. And probably from a range of disciplines, I would imagine. I was just going to talk a little bit about my own personal experience applying for fellowships when I was a graduate student, and then also helping some of my current PhD students or current and former PhD students apply for fellowships here too. Although, this will be definitely anecdotal information with a sample size of 1, and so please correct me if I'm saying something that's actually not true here or true, with a broader population. But just to give you a little bit about my background, so I'm a developmental psychologist. I study early social reasoning in kids is sort of the most general way to talk about what I do. I studied as an undergraduate, I studied cognitive science at Yale, and then I got my PhD at Harvard working in the psychology department. And then I moved here in 2008. So, I thought that I would, I did apply for a number of different fellowships when I was a graduate student, and I thought that they were really, really helpful in kind of launching my career for a couple different reasons. And so I definitely, this is probably preaching to the choir since you are all here on a Friday to hear about fellowship applications. But I definitely do encourage it as something that I think can be a really exciting, personally exciting and also really professionally interesting, and something that can kind of launch your career in different, in a different trajectory from what you might have expected otherwise. A couple of things. So when I was a graduate student, I was at Harvard in the psychology department. I had kind of a primary mentor and then one or two kind of secondary mentors. So, psychology is a really lab-based discipline, meaning that often you're conducting research, really in collaboration with a PI. So, all your projects are collaborative. It's not really the kind of subject where you can just, go and do your own thing, or where there's no dissertation write-up phase where you could be in a library somewhere else. And I know that that's the case in some other disciplines where it might be a little bit more independent, or you might need field work, or you might need to be in an archive. So I know there's a lot of methodology discipline, or disciplinary differences across the social sciences. I would say, if anything, being in psychology, in some ways it can be one of the harder fields to travel with, simply because it's so laboratory-based, and because there's such a pressure to be collecting data in your lab with your advisor in this kind of collaborative framework. And so I think, my personal thought is that if it's doable in psychology, and I really do think it is, it's probably doable, across all the different disciplines within the social sciences in some format or another, and whatever that format is for you probably could vary. So, for me, there were kind of two motivations, I think, that I had for applying for fellowships as a graduate student. So one was the funding structure that I had at Harvard was, it's a little different from what you guys are probably all on the GAI, is that right? No? Yes? Most of you? Okay. that is the right word, right? I'm not, okay, yeah. So it was a little different. So my funding structure, it came with 5 years of funding, and then I think you were docked if you didn't have an outside fellowship, and you had to teach to kind of make up the rest of the income. And so, but there wasn't the same kind of minimal level of teaching that was required, as part of your pedagogical experience, which I think is a good thing. For the record, I do think that some teaching is really important for your education. But so, I applied for a National Sciences Foundation grant to support, which supported 3 years of, tuition and whatnot, so that way I didn't have to teach for those years. So that was really helpful, just practically, of course, it was really nice to be able to focus on my research. And so, if you're eligible, I would say definitely apply. I also think that it was really helpful, just the process of applying is really helpful. And in fact, in psychology, we actually require all first-year students to put in an application. And some aren't eligible if they're not US citizens, or for, they have previous graduate training or that sort of thing. But we actually ask them through part of this first-year course, we ask them to put together an application anyways, or apply for something else, because I think just the process as a first or second year graduate student of, sitting down and saying, what is your research program? This could be for an NSF, or it could be for some other thing that's, applicable to your field if an NSF isn't, that I think it's a really helpful process to think about where you're going. So that was one thing that I did. And then a second thing was that I was actually really interested in working, partly, of course, at Harvard with my advisor, but I'd also developed this collaborative relationship with a researcher in Paris who was doing something really exciting at the time. He was using sort of a slightly different method from what I was using, but questions that would kind of overlap in interesting ways, and it seemed like a really great opportunity for me. A lot of my research focuses on kids thinking about language as sort of a marker of social group membership. So the idea of, you hear how somebody talks, and you're going to infer a lot of social information about who they are. And we wanted to test this in babies to see if, even pre-verbal infants are going to have the expectation, say, that, somebody who talks like your mom is somebody who's going to be, a good social partner to you. So it was really important, just for kind of methodological issues in my studies, that I actually tested two groups of babies who heard two different languages, so that way things could be counterbalanced across infants. So what that means is that way, if I found that babies in the US liked speakers of English compared to speakers of French, I would know it wasn't something about English being this extraordinarily wonderful language, or about the particular English speakers that I chose as being, somewhat more attractive to babies or something like this. And instead, by testing, showing the same kinds of stimuli to babies who heard English and babies who heard French, when I found that babies in the US liked the English speakers and babies in France liked the French speakers, I could conclude that this was something about the language and nothing about sort of the particular setup of my design. Okay, so it was important to me practically to find two different groups of listeners, babies exposed to two different environments. It didn't have to be France, it could have really been any language, but, to lay all my cards on the table, I also really enjoyed living in France. And I spoke French, and I thought it would be a really nice way to spend a couple years. So I was really interested in, kind of personally, I thought it would be interesting, but then also professionally, it was kind of a chance to get this subject group that I wanted, to work with this researcher who had some interesting tools to study infants' early social preferences. There's also, I was testing babies at the time. It turns out it's just like incredibly easy to get babies to come into a lab in France, I think in part because mothers have more flexible maternity leave policies, so a lot of women are actually home with their infant for, the first 6 to 12 months, say. And so it's just, a lot more flexible. And it was something that, practically was really easy to test a bunch of infants in France. So I had this goal in mind, and my advisor was really supportive about it. And so I applied for a few things. One thing that I had was a Fulbright fellowship for a year, which was great, and I'd be happy to talk in more detail about Fulbright. I think that Fulbright is a really fun fellowship opportunity because not only do you get to go to this kind of cultural immersion environment, but you're also with this other cohort of American scholars from different places who all go together. You get, there's various kinds of activities. It's kind of it's got this whole infrastructure about it that I think is really nice when you're a PhD student kind of just working on your own project. It's nice to go somewhere and have this automatic, built-in cultural experience. So that was great. And then I also had a few other fellowships that were specific for study in France. So they're probably not that meaningful. My guess is they were probably Harvard specific. There's a LURSI one. Do we have LURSI? Oh, okay, we have LURSI. And a Frederick Sheldon traveling grant. Okay, that was probably Harvard specific then. There was also this Harvard École Normale Supérieure, which is where I studied. There was this exchange program that they had. Do we have? We have a similar one with a different institution. Sciences Po? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So we had a Sciences, so they had that too. So okay, so I ended up getting all of those things. And I think in part, honestly, not because I was that amazing an applicant, I think it's in part because I applied for them and because I didn't get the sense there were that many people applying for all of these opportunities, particularly the really, specific one that, you want to go to, Sciences Po, which is like this center of political studies and economic studies and things like that in France. If you've got, a proposal that makes sense and you've made contacts with people there and that sort of thing. I don't know how competitive it is here, but my guess is that if you're a good fit, you're going to end up having a good chance that a lot of it is about fit. So, I had this advisor, I had this project that seemed like it kind of needed to happen in this lab in France, and, I was really excited about this exchange. So I couldn't take all of these things at once, but I ended up asking for some. I remember I got sort of some different parts of all the different ones. I took the Fulbright for half of the year and maybe the LURSI for the other half, or I was actually there for about 1.5 years, so maybe it was the Fulbright for, 7 to 9 months or something, and then the LURSI for the rest. And then with the exchange one thing they wouldn't give me, I didn't need a stipend because I had a stipend from this other thing, so, but they gave me housing for free, and it turns out that the stipends didn't have a problem with you having somewhere, because there was an exchange, so you stayed in a dorm, so, it was a dorm, it wasn't that nice, but it was free, and that was great. And then the other one, the Frederick Sheldon, which I think is a Harvard-specific one, they were actually, it was kind of flexible whether it was about a stipend versus research costs. So I ended up saying to them, look, I've got this other stipend, but could you support research costs? And they were happy to do that. So I guess kind of my bottom line is just, apply, because I think for a lot of these things, it might seem like a long shot, but if you actually have a good proposal or you're a good fit for what they're looking for, I think your chances of getting it are probably fairly good. And then be creative. If you end up getting more than one thing, it's possible you might not have to turn them down. You can't usually double dip in the sense of just getting, 2 stipends at once. But if one thing's for your research and one thing's for your, personal expenses and that sort of thing, sometimes these fellowship agencies are flexible. Like they're excited about you, they're excited about your project, and my sense was at least that they're going to, want to fund you in some way if they can make it work. So, I think that this experience for me in France was just really rewarding. My biggest paper from graduate school came out of this exchange and this time in France. And so, in some ways that was probably really why I got a job here. I think that it was really interesting for me to build collaborations. It's the kind of thing, someday down the road, if you have a tenure track job somewhere, one part of your review is building an international reputation. And so in that sense, if you've kind of already done that and you've got these, buddies in France who already know you or wherever your country of choice is, I think that that can also be a positive thing. So I think that my general advice about these things is to, apply for things and be creative, and don't think that just because something's a long shot that it's not worth it. I thought I would just give an example from an undergraduate I was working with recently who was going to apply for a Fulbright. She's a fourth year, and she was going to apply for a Fulbright, and she had a really great proposal, but for whatever reason, she ended up kind of getting discouraged and thinking that she kind of didn't have a shot this year, and maybe she should wait and apply in a future year, and I think she just kind of got, down on herself throughout this process in some way and felt like the odds were just so daunting and it wasn't worth it. And so I talked to her about it, and I personally thought it was crazy. I think she's a great applicant. She has a very good chance of getting this, and she's a very strong student. And she said, but, she'd missed the University of Chicago deadline, so it was just like, it's too bad she can't do this. So I don't know if the fellowship office would like for me to go on record saying apply for things late. But, I said, well, why don't we just call and ask? And so, I called and I said, look, my student, she messed up. She knows she messed up, but she's a great applicant. And for whatever reason, she got discouraged about this, and they were really helpful. This is the undergraduate office. They were really helpful in basically kind of squeezing her in at the last minute and, getting her to still apply. So I think that people want to work with you, and even if you've got something that seems like you're not sure it's the right fit, or you're not sure about this deadline, or, whatever it is, I think it usually can't hurt to ask. I think that when you're thinking about this kind, particularly with the international fellowship, I think it's good to be creative about how this could really help your career, and there's probably a number of different ways, so as I said, there were a few ways that this was really helpful to me, but, this could be about a mentor you really want to work with, this could be about a population that's really exciting to you, this could be about something as simple as, ease of subject recruitment somewhere. One kind of caveat I would add, and this might depend on your discipline, is to think about involving your current mentor here as much as possible. So for instance, my mentor at Harvard, she was really excited about me spending time in France because I'm like, look, I'm going to get all these, these babies to test, and we're going to be developing this new method there, and this is really exciting. And she was, really a collaborator on the project through the whole, the whole process. She was an author on the resulting publications and so forth. And so in that sense, it was like kind of a win-win. Everyone's interests were aligned. If I'd said, hey, Liz, I'm going to Paris for 2 years. It's going to be awesome. Sorry, I'm not your graduate student. That would not have gone over well, because you have to remember, for faculty, there's also pressures. They want to get their research done. A lot of times they recruit you as a student instead of some other student. So if you're just going to, take off for a couple of years, that might not, again, depending on your discipline, maybe this is, typical in your discipline. But if it's not typical, you want to make sure that kind of your interests are in line with those of your primary mentor, and if you can involve that person in a collaboration, I think that that's something that that can go really well. So I also just wanted to mention, I've had students here who have applied for fellowships too, some who have been awarded the NSF as well, which is great. But then also I had one student, Jocelyn, who she graduated last year, and she really wanted to do research in Northern Ireland on a topic that was, a little different. She was interested from what I do, but, kind of close enough. She was interested in questions about kids' sort of, ethnic and religious social categorization, how they think about different ethnic groups, and how being in a situation of conflict might sort of change early social categorization. So she, again, found collaborators in Northern Ireland. They're also, developmental and social psychologists like us. And she was awarded A couple things, or a few things. So one is a Council for European Studies pre-dissertation award from the Mellon Foundation. And then she also got a Social Sciences Research Council Fellowship for Graduate Studies. So I think this is all on the website probably, because I imagine that's how she found it. And so, these were two different things that supported two independent trips. And then she also had a Nicholson Center for British Studies Graduate Fellowship, which is a U of C thing. And I think that actually ended up supporting her research costs, and the other one supported her stipend costs. So again, she kind of, had some things that were for research and some things that were for stipend, and that worked really well. And, I felt excited about it because, though she left my lab for a year, it was, projects that I was excited about too, and so I could really get on board. So yeah, I think that my general advice is that these things are not actually, applying is often the biggest barrier to entry. Figuring out the right project and thinking about how you could, kind of grow resources in your graduate career to make yourself, I think it can make you a little bit unique on the job market. I think it can open up different kinds of research activities from those that you might, just experience here at the University of Chicago. I should say I actually still graduated in 5 years, even though I spent almost 2 of them in France. So it didn't really slow me down. If anything, I think it sort of sped me up because I was actually able to collect data there a lot faster than I was at Harvard. So I think that's all. I don't know, are we gonna, questions or?
If you have specific questions for Professor Kinsler, you can ask them now, but we're also gonna have a panel now, and she will also be on the panel, so we can continue the discussion there.
Okay.
Go to the panel.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so we've got a really great panel here. So I guess we'll start, maybe everyone could just sort of say who you are and, just who you are and what you're doing right now.
Sure.
My name is Jessica Smith. I know some of you personally. I'm the Assistant Director of Fellowships and Graduate Student Affairs. So there isn't a centralized fellowship office for graduate students here per se. That's kind of me. I'm a hub of information for all sorts of different kinds of fellowships. I'm actually the campus advisor for certain large national competitions like Fulbright, the Boren Fellowship, National Science Foundation. So I've been trained specifically on those fellowships, and for some of them you actually have to go through our office to apply for them, such as the Fulbright. But just in general, I'm like a middle person between students, faculty members, and program directors of fellowships. So even if I'm not the expert on what you're looking for, I can definitely connect you with the right person.
My name is Elizabeth Todd Breland. I graduated from the history department in 2010, and I'm now an assistant professor of history at UIC. And I had a number of fellowships, both as a graduate student and then later as a postdoc, and now you still apply as a faculty member. So I'd be happy to talk about those experiences.
Hi, I'm a PhD student, a 6th year in anthropology, and I'm recently back from the field where I had a Fulbright Hays. I've applied and gotten a few other fellowships, including an NSF, a Javits, and a couple of regional grants. So I'm happy to talk about those, and also a little bit about field work for those who might be interested in that.
We met, I think.
And I think you guys can use your mics as well. And so as I said, I'm the Associate Dean of Students in Social Sciences, and I've worked with students specifically on the NSF. Every year I do writing groups for students applying for NSF, the ones who aren't in psychology. I've also helped students apply for the Ford Foundation Predoctoral Fellowship and the SSRC IDRF. And occasionally people come to me with other ones and I try to help them. But administratively, I'm also the person in the division who collects applications for things like the Mellon Write-Up Fellowship, our other write-up fellowships, also things like the Liebman, and various other divisional grants that we give, travel grants we give, research grants, summer grants, and I'm sometimes on the committee who helps decide some of those sorts of grants as well, so I've sort of been on both sides of things. So one of the things I want to talk about is sort of what skills do you get, not just in having a fellowship, but what skills do you get out of the actual application process? And what do you learn about yourself while you're applying for a fellowship? What do you learn about yourself when you don't win the fellowship? So maybe our panel can sort of just talk a little bit about those sorts of experiences.
And I think thinking expansively about yourself and your work. I studied the history of race and education in Chicago, and we don't have a school of education here, but I still applied for education fellowships, and I only knew about those because I sort of talked to other people and peers and thought about myself in the broadest terms possible. And so I recommend that, and I think that's one thing that it makes you do is think about the sort of interdisciplinary nature of your work, even if you don't consider yourself an interdisciplinary scholar per se. But the other thing is I think it's really good professional practice if you intend on continuing on towards an academic career. I just finished up a round of applying for fellowships, and I'm in my second year of my position. And so it becomes something that's just like, oh, it's fall, it's fellowship season, time to apply, or whenever they're due in your discipline. And I think that it's really important to start that practice as a graduate student. I think early in my graduate career, and I should say I came in to the U of C with a Ford pre-doctoral fellowship, and I had also won a Mellon, which I couldn't take at the same time, so I didn't take that. But I think because it was sort of part of my graduate application process as well, I just kept doing it, right? So, but I think that the early ones, particularly for fellowships that were for either early graduate school or pre-dissertation write-up, it really forced you to think about, you know, what do I want to study? What is my work about? How can it speak to different types of audiences and make that case? I mean, if we talk about nothing else in the division, right, it's like, make an argument, make an argument. That's what a fellowship application is. You're making an argument for yourself and why you should get this particular fellowship and why it's going to be helpful for your professional, personal, whatever the case may be, development. So I think it's just a good practice to get in the habit of, whether you win some, you lose some, but it's going to be something that you're going to have to continue to do at the very least, or should continue to do at the very least throughout the course of your graduate student career, and most likely if you continue on in an academic career, you should be doing this for the rest of your career. So.
I would agree with almost everything you said, and the other thing I will just add is that last night when I was thinking about this panel, I went and I looked at some of my early pre-dissertation grants, which were the NSF and the JAVITs, and the interesting thing for me was, although my project changed completely and almost nothing that I proposed to study actually in the end became my dissertation topic, the practice of being able to say, here's the problem that I'm going to define as my project, and here's like a set of methodological ways that I'm going to address this problem, and here's a couple of theoretical or conceptual orientations that are going to guide me. That process is the same across all the grants. So now I'm writing grants for dissertation write-up, and I'm still using a lot of the same kind of genre skills, and it's interesting to me that even though everything content-wise has changed, in some ways the form carries itself through. So I don't recognize the NSF that I wrote 6 years ago, but I recognize it as a grant that has this kind of presentation of a problem and a way of addressing it. And the other thing I will just add is that, at least in my department, and I think this is true for a lot of disciplines, when we do get to the point of talking about our projects with our advisors or our friends, we oftentimes say, like, this is what I'm interested in studying, and we talk a lot about, you know, the theoretical interests that we have and what its impact might be, but we don't often talk amongst ourselves about methods. And I think grants are a really great opportunity to think, all right, I have a problem that I'm interested in, but like, what are the skills that I can deploy to actually study this problem? Like, it may sound great on paper, but when you have to think, you know, do I need to do field work, or do I need to get to the archives to answer this question, or do I need to do interviews? It makes you think in a very different way about research than just saying to an advisor, here's the topic I'm interested in. So.
Yeah, so, and I want to add to this that these skills are not just useful if you're going into academic careers, and one of the things we want to really open the conversation about this year is that it's okay if you don't want to go into academic careers. There's a whole world of careers out there that aren't necessarily becoming a professor. And so I think that you can really gain valuable skills in fellowship applications specifically that can help you in these other kinds of careers. And what I mean by that is that applying for a fellowship is a very particular kind of thing, that you're writing for an audience that isn't your professors. So in some cases, maybe the people reading a fellowship application are in fact professors in your field. If you're applying to NSF, this is probably the case. But in a lot of cases, these are maybe faculty members, but could be very far outside your field. Sometimes it's just, possibly educated people, but not necessarily faculty. Not necessarily doing anything close to what you do, who are reading your applications. And so you need to be able to communicate with a wide variety of audiences. And you very specifically need to be able to show why the things that you are doing are valuable in a way to be funded. And so I'll tell you, when I left graduate school, and I did not go all the way to the PhD, and I left graduate school and started applying for jobs, and the question I did not expect that I got every single time was, well, how is it useful that you have a master's degree? What does this do for you, or do for us? What skills do you have that you're going to bring to this job, because you have no job experience? And so I think applying for fellowships helps you sort of think in very particular ways about what skills do I have, and what am I learning in a way, how do I communicate this to people who are not my professors in the classroom about what I've been doing, and how do I do it in 2 pages in a fellowship application? If you're applying for a job, you probably have a little bit more room. You go into a job talk where you get to talk about your research for 20 minutes. But if you have to boil it down into 2 minutes, if you have to boil it down into an answer for an interview question about what have I been doing and how is this useful to your company, I think that it's a very good thing to start practicing very early and to keep thinking about those sorts of things. So if you're not sure what you want to do yet, or if you are sure that you don't want to be a professor, then as you're applying for fellowships, thinking in that way, thinking in the way that, how am I expressing myself, I think can be really useful.
Can I just add something to that? So the student that I mentioned, Jocelyn, the one who got all the fellowships to go to Northern Ireland, she graduated last year and decided that academia wasn't for her, and she wanted to do something that was still research-based, but more along the lines of kind of research consulting. But I think that the fellowships were really helpful to her, both for articulating to a broader audience, why her questions, what was she doing in graduate school for 6 or 7 years, but then also I think that actually it was a really good selling point for her to be able to say, as part of her graduate school experience, one thing she did was she developed this international collaboration. She sought funding for it to fund this project. It almost made it seem like more of this kind of business adventure, which in some ways it was, right? That she applied for funding, she had it, she funded this research program, she developed collaboration, she got schools on board in Northern Ireland. So there were kind of a lot of pieces to this puzzle that she worked out, and so I think that she was really able to frame it in this way that was, would have certainly been useful for an academic career, but was also useful for the beginning of her non-academic career.
Yeah. Just one last thing to speak to that. When I went on the job market, I knew I wasn't leaving Chicago, so I also applied to non-academic jobs, and I used some of the same materials. Clearly, you're not using the exact same materials, but I mean, I borrowed sentences back and forth for cover letters, for my academic jobs, for my completely non-related to the university jobs, for consulting positions. And the other thing is that I found them really, my proposal applications became really useful as I was trying to write job letters for academic jobs. So I feel like they had a number of sort of the genre, as you were saying, of this proposal writing, and to market yourself as having written grants, proposals for grants before, which can be really useful in a number of industries, if you want to say. And that's what you're doing, right? You're writing a grant proposal.
And I've also found, I said every year I do this NSF writing workshop, and at least one, maybe a couple of my people are here. And every year at the end of the sort of, it's a whirlwind, but about 5 weeks of constantly meeting and writing and tweaking applications, invariably people tell me, it doesn't even matter if I win this or not. This was a really useful experience. And I think that one of the reasons it's such a useful experience is that it forces them to think very, very early about what is my project. Now, as Mahal said, it changes completely. And that's very, very common that a project is going to change from, when you're a first-year graduate student, or not even yet a first-year graduate student, to when you actually do your project. But being forced to think, as she said, about methods specifically, and, we often get first drafts of these research proposals that are like, I'm going to use qualitative methods. okay, well, that can mean a lot of different things. What sorts of qualitative methods are you going to use? And so being forced to think in that way as early as possible, I think is good, even if the projects themselves are going to change a lot. Okay, so, and maybe you guys haven't ever had this experience. Are there any fellowships you didn't win that you've applied to? And, you know, have you sort of thought through, you know, was this just not a good fit? Was there something you didn't do well in the application? If you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, when you apply to lots of fellowships, you get lots of rejections as well. So, I mean, I guess I'm trying to think of like the names of them right now. I can't recall, but you apply to so many internal to the U of C, outside of the U of C, that you're going to get rejections. Some of them are really great because they'll actually give you the feedback from reviewers of your application. Whether you get the fellowship or don't get the fellowship, some large, particularly national funding agencies will give you reviewers' feedback. So that's always helpful. Because I also recommend if you're eligible for a fellowship for multiple years, just because you didn't get it the first year doesn't mean that you shouldn't apply again. I know lots of people who get things on the second time around. So I found that useful. And then I guess just generally, even when you don't get things, I still found it useful for the reasons I was talking about earlier in terms of the practice and what it's applicable for in different ways.
Yeah, I think we have a pretty low batting average, or at least I feel okay with that, because we certainly send a lot of grants. One thing I want to say is that about rejection, one of the good reasons to start applying now and just apply early and apply often is that in my experience, a lot of grants I didn't get the first round, and I got reviewer feedback and I incorporated it. And it was only after revising the grant and thinking about the feedback I got on the first round that I was able to get it on the second round. Just to give an example, I had what's known as a Wenner-Gren anthropological fieldwork dissertation grant. And they're not a lot of money, but they're really competitive in my discipline, and they're kind of like a badge of honor, and there's an expectation that you really want to get one, and I did. I maybe went through 3 rounds of revisions with the Wenner-Gren, and I think that with some of the really highly competitive grants, that's almost expected. So if you waited until you thought your project was perfect to submit, you wouldn't go to the field until you were like in your 5th year because you were waiting for things to be perfect. If you start to apply early and often, you can get through that kind of revision process. And by the time you're ready to go to the field, hopefully you've moved far along on the revision, what do they want, what do I want, track that, you know, you'll get funded. But rejection is certainly part of the game, and revisions and rewriting is also part of the game.
I also think this idea of, like, of course you're not going to get everything you apply for, that, you know, developing a thick skin in that kind of sense, I think, is important. And it also really prepares, if you are interested in an academic path, it really does prepare you for being a faculty member where, you know, at least I think, I guess it's kind of hard to compare what's harder or what's more, you know, has a higher chance of probability. But I know for things like if you're, you know, a faculty member applying for a large federal grant, you know, the NIH funds probably, you know, the funding line is probably somewhat under 10% of things that are, you know, sent in. It's a little higher than that, actually, when you think about the idea that people can apply at least twice. And so then if you think about it, it's like, well, that's, you know, of all chances, but if no one gets it on their first try, then, you know, it's like, it ends up being a little bit higher than that. But I think that it's really good because you're just not going to get most of the things you apply for, probably, but everything that I read from people who are really successful grant getters kind of in the long run, they say, you know, it's like, how did you get all this grant funding? It's like, well, I applied for a lot of stuff, you know, that number of applications seems to really be highly correlated with number of successful applications. I don't know, if you haven't read The Complete Academic, I really recommend it. It's, I don't know, it's somewhat psychology focused, but it's kind of advice in general on being a graduate student and, you know, professional development kind of stuff. But there's a whole chapter on grant getting that's basically, you know, talking to people who are really good at getting grants, and what they say is that they, you know, they don't think that they get on average more things than people who don't apply. It's just that, you know, they apply for more things.
In the end, I know that it's not, but at times the fellowship selection process can feel like arbitrary, like just from the advisor's standpoint. Sometimes I see a student not win a grant that is not that competitive, and then in the same year win one that's highly competitive. So a lot of the times it is just about things being a good fit. but it's worth it to put in your hat for as many things as you're eligible for, because yeah, there's definitely a correlation there. And then another thing, sometimes students worry about applying before they're ready because they're afraid that, oh, well, you know, I'm going to leave a bad impression. Like, can I apply again? Yes, I don't know of any fellowship programs that won't allow you to apply again if you haven't won the first time around. In fact, you know, sometimes it's even an advantage. For some programs, it's the same reviewers year after year, and they might remember your proposal and be impressed with the improvements that you've made, new affiliations that you've gained. I actually saw this. As an advisor, I can sit in on some of the Fulbright reviews, and I actually saw the reviewers remember an applicant from the year before and decide to push them forward in that year. So that's never a disadvantage.
Yeah. Just on that too, so the postdoc that I had when I left here was a one-year postdoc, the Mellon ACLS, which is actually a humanities, but it's for humanities and related social sciences. So again, make a case for yourself. But for that one, I was only eligible for it for that 1 year because you had to have it the year after you had some other national fellowship or a dissertation Mellon. And I had the Spencer, which was a national education fellowship. So I applied for this postdoc. I didn't really feel ready for a postdoc. I had a kind of draft of one of my dissertation chapters. But I applied anyway, and then I also, everything else I applied for were dissertation write-ups. I didn't get any of the dissertation write-ups, and I got the postdoc. So I finished my dissertation, and I had a postdoc. But I say that to say, you know, if you're getting close, do it. And particularly for these things that there are these limited windows for which you're eligible, I say go for it. And I will also say that most of the people I know who finished sort of in a shorter time period, which I guess, you know, for you, I think I finished in 6 years, which for my department here is actually pretty decent. We go very long in history here. I think that everyone I know had something waiting for them that forced them to finish. So having that postdoc meant it had to get done, right? So I think there's also something for like to use fellowships or use something as sort of a finish line to get there. And that can be for a dissertation write-up as well if there's a timeline involved.
So I have a question I didn't prep you guys for. Applying for fellowships takes a lot of time, especially if you're applying for a lot of fellowships. How do you manage that time management and figure out, it's one thing to say, apply for everything you're possibly eligible for, but how do you decide practically how to limit it and how to decide what you actually have time to apply for without getting in the way of all of your other obligations?
Well, I think almost the anxiety about the time commitment can sometimes actually be more than the time commitment. Some of these things are 2-page applications, and not to say that that can't take a long time, but if you're applying for multiple things, you can reuse the kind of thinking you've used before. You can do something like say, I'm going to apply for this, but I'm not going to let it take over my life, and I'm going to work on it for X, Y, and Z number of days, and then at the end of it, that's kind of what it is, and that's what I'm going to do. And I think that approach is better than not applying or having a tremendous amount of anxiety about whether you're going to apply and, ruminating on that and then not doing anything else and then missing the deadline, whatever other kinds of, mental roadblocks that people set up for themselves. But I think that question is kind of, that kind of trade-off is going to happen between, among all your activities as you go forward in academia, that you're going to have teaching and you're going to have research, you're going to have grant writing and you're going to have research, you're going to have committee work. There's all sorts of things that can kind of take up your time, but I do think it's something that's worth some degree of prioritization, but probably within a reasonable limit such that you don't just write fellowships for a year and not do any research.
Yeah, I would definitely agree to take it as an exercise and to invest time in it for it to be good, but to recognize that it's not the case that if you were to work on a grant for another 100 hours, it would necessarily be that much better than it was after the first 100. Because at some point, it's a good grant, and it's probably going to get funded if you get the right reviewer or if it doesn't. But it's not like there's limited returns on investment after a certain point. So I would take that for what it is. But also, if you're in a discipline that expects there to be some kind of preliminary data. I know in anthropology, there's often this sense of, well, they want us to already know what our projects are when we're asking for funding to do the project, and how do you convince people that your project is real before you've done the field work for which you're asking money. And I think a really good way to get around that problem is to just use your summers to do the preliminary work. And there are smaller travel grants that will fund 2-3 months. In my case, I got a grant from the Palestinian American Research Center to do 3 months of summer research. And then when I came to the grant writing part, I could say, like, I already have these preliminary findings, and I have affiliation letters, and I've met with these organizations, and I have these people who I've been in contact with. None of that would have happened if I hadn't had the summer. And it made writing the grant in the fall much, much easier, because I sort of had a sense of at least being able to say, like, yeah, I kind of know what my field sites might be, and maybe it'll change, but building those relationships in the summer is invaluable.
Yeah. I'd just like to reinforce that also of applying for small stuff as well, right? There are these huge, large national grants. There are huge grants based within the U of C, but you should also apply for all types of small short-term funding because it's a lot of that short-term funding that gives you the space and time to get the work done you need to then sort of put a better application forth for the big ones. But I guess on this, I mean, start early, right? And this is one of those, you know, do as I say, not as I do kind of situations. But as I've gone on, you have to learn to do that, right? And so maybe that means if you know what your year sort of schedule looks like and where high times and low times are, you know you have to teach fall quarter. Well, maybe you're going to make, you know, the last 2 weeks of August and the first week of September grant writing time, and you're going to block it off and you're just going to do it there. Or maybe you're someone who works better doing a little bit every week, you know, for some longer period of time. But I do think you need to be intentional about creating the space and separating time for it. But the other thing is, and I feel like there's two approaches to this. If you're going to apply to a lot of fellowships, you can either, one, start with the hardest one that requires the most documents. Like I know the Ford required like 8 different attachments, things you had to upload. And so it was just a beast. And I didn't ever want to sort of mess with it, and so I'd save it for last sometimes. Or you could do the reverse, do the Ford first, or whatever your large requires a lot of stuff first, and then the rest of them seem really easy, right? After you have this, you know, this one only requires 2 uploads, a personal statement and a plan of research, done. So I think that can be really helpful. And then to also, once you write one, the rest are so much easier to write because you already have the language, you've already detailed your project, you have a plan, you just have to sort of tweak them. So.
Yeah, so just in general, and I think that you all emphasize this, be really proactive and not reactive towards, you know, planning for applying to fellowships. You want to be in a position where you have a plan several months before the deadlines instead of a week before the deadline, seeing an email come through from your department administrator and being like, oh, I need to apply to that. And then you're rushing and making your life and your recommenders' lives and maybe my life miserable, which I'm happy to help, but it's better for everybody if you can be proactive. And just, again, in general, rule of thumb is that a lot of the external deadlines are going to fall in the fall quarter. Some of them very early in the fall quarter, like the Fulbright U.S. student program typically is the deadline. The internal deadline is the first day of fall quarter. But most of the deadlines for external programs have passed by this time of the year. And so if you can, I know it almost sounds like ridiculous, but at the beginning of summer, just making a plan for yourself, figuring out which fellowships you're going to apply to that fall, getting at least an outline in place so that you can work off of that for the different proposals, and communicating with your recommenders. On a recent faculty fellowship panel, one of the faculty members said that he always asks, you know, he'll write as many letters of recommendation as he needs to, but he likes some forewarning. And if you're applying to 5, 6, 7 different programs, he would like just one email from you with a proposal and a description of each of the programs and the date that he needs to submit that recommendation by, because it's hard for your recommenders to keep it all organized too. And so they have the best of intentions, but it's easy to let those things, if they're dealing with 5 or 6 different emails from you, it's easy to get things mixed up. So even being prepared and organized for your recommenders is a really, really good way to stay on track.
Because no one wants that awkward moment when you're like, hi, I sent you that email 3 weeks ago. Did you upload it yet? It says it's not uploaded, but I don't. It's not good.
So do you guys have questions for our panel? Yeah.
This might be pretty silly. It says on here, under things to keep in mind, it says use short stints abroad wisely. I just wanted to know what you meant by that.
Yeah, so I'm going to repeat all the questions since we've got video. So the question was about the advice to use short stints abroad wisely. So, I think I can talk a little bit, and maybe Jessica can talk a little bit about that too. There are a lot of short-term research grants out there. There's a lot through our area centers on campus. The division has some. So these are very small amounts of money, $2,000 usually, or around that. But you can do a lot of good in those sorts, with those sorts of grants. So if you get a grant to go abroad, let's say your research site is in London, and you get a $2,000 grant, which isn't going to last you very long in London, and you can do a little bit of preliminary research. If you need to work in archives, you can go and you can meet the people who run the archives. You can figure out what the process is at that archive. You can learn the schedule so that when you're applying for bigger fellowships, you already know a lot of these sorts of details, and you can really show your command of the material that you're talking about in a fellowship application if you can say, look, I know exactly how I need to schedule the research I'm going to do. I'm going to be able to hit the ground running when I get to the research site that you are going to fund me to get to. So I think that's one way in particular that if you get a short-term, very small amount of money kind of research grant, that you can really set yourself up not just for success in your research, but success in future applications for fellowships.
And then, so there's all sorts of different pre-dissertation grants that are available, but then there's also like language study grants, like the Foreign Language and Area Study Fellowship, which you can use to go abroad and do language study, and you can use the little extra time that you have there to, schedule an appointment with a potential affiliation or visit an archive. And so I would highly recommend doing those things and maximizing all of your experiences that you have in your future field site.
Did that answer your question? Okay.
So under your can help, it says that the Dean of Students Office and Graduate Student Affairs can help.
Mm-hmm.
How do you help? Like, what do you actually offer in terms of resources and support for fellowship?
Sure. So the question is, how can offices on campus help with applications? So the Dean of Students Office and Graduate Student Affairs. So in particular, I do help people write applications, edit applications for specific kinds of fellowships. So for NSF, definitely we can help with that. I've helped people edit their applications for SSRC, IDRF, definitely Ford Foundation. So there are a few that I can help with that. Now, I have to build time into my schedule for those things, and as you may understand, that's not my only responsibility in the Dean of Students Office. So things like the NSF, that's built into my fall schedule. This is what I work on in fall. But generally, if a person comes to me with enough advance notice, I can give them at least some time editing help. And I'm not an expert in every kind of fellowship, but I do know something about the genre of writing for fellowships, and so I can help in that regard. So that sort of thing. I can also help students in terms of just figuring out what should my schedule look like for my whole graduate career. When would I be getting different kinds of fellowships? If I get a fellowship to do research abroad, what does that do to the funding package I have through the university? So those sorts of logistical and practical questions. And then also I know a lot about the divisional fellowships that we give. And I will say that I can't help anybody with sort of editing their application if it's an internal fellowship, because I'm also part of the process for deciding on those fellowships. But I can certainly give you a good sense of what we're looking for in those fellowships, what all of those kinds of fellowships and grants are, how and when you might use them.
So like I said, I'm the program advisor or the campus advisor for some specific programs like the Fulbright. So I have just a lot of knowledge about that. I've gotten trained on it. I get to sit in on the review session. So I do a lot of individualized advising on those types of programs that I have a lot of experience with. But then in a general sense too, I can kind of just sit down with you and brainstorm about what is my fellowship trajectory, what should I be applying for, when. I have a pretty extensive archive of sample successful essays that I can share with you. I've gotten permission from the winners to share them with UChicago applicants. That can be really helpful when you're trying to start figuring out how do I structure my essay, what are the things that work for people for this specific program. I also have sample letters of affiliation. Sometimes it can be confusing exactly what that means. What is an affiliation? What sort of terms do you have to agree to? Our office has a dedicated statement reviewer, Megan Hammond, who works from home and can edit your proposal for you. She's actually on maternity leave until mid-January, and in the meantime, I'm doing that. So there's always somebody in GSA who will review your proposal for you and provide feedback from a generalist standpoint. And then I just manage a lot of communications around fellowships. So I recently started to build the content for a new fellowship database that's filterable and that will be maintained and constantly growing. And I hope that will be a good resource for you. You can find it on grad.uchicago.edu under fellowships and funding. And I'm just also a direct line of communication with all of the funding agencies. I know specific people at the Department of Education, which can be very helpful during uncertain times like a shutdown and you're wondering if you're going to get your stipend check. I can also, glean information from the program director with a simple phone call that you can't just get off the website. I can even arrange for somebody to come and give an information session on campus. So we have pretty broad offerings in GSA.
I just, as a grant applicant, a recent one who went through GSA many, many times, one thing I really want to just underscore that Jessica mentioned is that the archive that you guys have of former successful IIEs and Fulbright Hayes is incredible. And I remember correctly, it was like organized by region, and I could also look at applications from particular years, and I basically spent an afternoon, and I would advise anyone looking to apply for those grants to do the same thing, making copies of about 15, 20 different grants, and I came home and I just read them all. And what you'll see is even when the projects are very different, and even when people come from different disciplines, there is a kind of shared form, there's a shared genre across the grants about how they articulate their problem, how they frame themselves in relationship to the literature in their fields or to a broader intervention. And I don't know any other way to kind of get that level of familiarity with a grant and what they're looking for without reading all these other older successful applications. And it's something that when I talk to friends of mine at other universities, and I'll say, like, why don't you go to your graduate student office and read all the former successful grants? And they'll look at me like I'm crazy because their universities don't necessarily offer that kind of service. So it's actually a pretty valuable resource that I didn't realize not everyone has access to, but you do, so you should definitely make use of it.
That's a really great point too about any time, whether they have something in-house or not. If you know other people who have been successful applicants, if they don't want to give you their stuff, you could have them take a look at your application, and that can also be really helpful in terms of getting some feedback. And also, I know we've talked a lot about travel grants, but my entire project was based in the city of Chicago, and I still got money. So there are ways, like even if you're not looking necessarily for money to travel abroad, there are still ways, if you have to put a budget together. I still use the recording equipment that I got based on some fellowship today when I do interviews. So there are lots of ways you can spend this money they want to give you.
Yeah, and I will say so I have a very limited database of successful essays, limited just to NSF, although we're thinking about sort of building that out for some of the other ones. But what I do have is an access to a student database where I can look and tell you if anyone has ever won a fellowship from the university. And I can then get in touch with them and ask them if it's okay to share their name with you and get in touch with you. So certainly, especially if it's sort of an offbeat fellowship that you're not sure anyone has ever won before, I can access that sort of information as well. Yes?
So you have spoke about being a good fit for a fellowship as a important criteria for winning it. So other than that, what are some other tips that we should keep in mind not in fourth quarter to be a competitive candidate?
Yeah, so the question is, what are the sort of tips to winning a fellowship? And so I was going to do a PowerPoint, but I think some of you got the PowerPoint on paper, and I don't want to pull it up, so I'll just sort of talk to you guys about it. And if anyone didn't get the PowerPoint, I can email that as well. So I put some tips on there, and some of them are things like start early. So we've talked about that a little bit. So start early in your graduate career, looking ahead to fellowships. Start early looking at deadlines for fellowships, because they're usually a year ahead of a funding cycle, or at least 6 months ahead of a funding cycle, so you need to know pretty early. But also start early for a particular application. So if an application is due November 1st, then set yourself a deadline of being done with it by October 25th. So that you don't run into problems where you try to upload and it won't upload and you don't know who to contact and it's the last minute, or your faculty recommender dropped the ball and didn't get the recommendation in. So sort of planning everything out really far in advance, I think, is one really important tip, to sort of keeping yourself from getting stressed out about the process, for one, but also doing a successful application. We've talked a little bit about this already, but talking to your faculty members, making sure they are on board with the project that you are doing. It's a really bad sign when you read an application and the student's essay about what they're going to be doing and the faculty member's letter describing what they're going to be doing are very, very different. You want to make sure that your faculty member understands the project or the type of fellowships you're applying for, that they're ready for you to be applying in this cycle. I've had students who are ready to submit a write-up fellowship, and the faculty member said, "You are not ready to write up next year. I am not writing you a letter." So making sure you and they are on the same page very far in advance on those sorts of things. They can also help you, so talking to your faculty members is very useful in that way. If you don't have a faculty advisor yet, or you're not sure you have an advisor yet, getting to know someone in your department, someone with whom you plan to work, is a very good idea. And sometimes faculty members will even read your essays and give you feedback. They're probably not going to be able to do it 5 or 6 times like I might, but they might at least be able to read one draft for you. So asking, so that can be really helpful. Reading the application itself carefully. So if they're asking you to respond to a specific essay prompt, then respond to that specific essay prompt. There's usually a list of questions. Open up Word, type in those questions, and then answer them. I think that's really something that people struggle with, partly because they want to sort of share essays between applications. And it's well, I use this essay for NSF, it's already really good, I'm going to use it for this too, but this other application is asking for something slightly different. And so you have to tweak it. That doesn't mean you have to change it completely, but you have to tweak it. So making sure you really read the application. What are the requirements? It's supposed to be on 8.5 by 11 paper with 1-inch margins and Times New Roman font. They will throw out your application if it's not, so make sure you read that detail about what it's supposed to be. So that, I think, is a really important and sort of overlooked point in applying for these things. And then one really important thing for me is writing clearly. So I'll get a first draft of an application from somebody, and I just don't even understand a word of it. And I'll bring them into my office, and I'll say, "Can you explain to me what your project is?" Crystal clear when they talk to me. I understand every word. It sounds like a fascinating, exciting project. And so getting that sort of language back into your essay is super crucial. So these are often very short. The IDRF is 10 pages. That's the longest one I've seen. I don't know how long Fulbright is.
It's about the same.
About 10 pages.
A little
Sometimes these things are 2 or 3 pages. So they're really short. These are not dissertation proposals when you write applications for any of these. Even our dissertation write-ups, we usually want no more than a 4-page sort of prospectus of your dissertation. And so it's really vital that you write as clearly as possible. And so don't think about the kind of language you might use in a dissertation. Don't think about the kind of language that might impress a senior faculty member. Think about, how can I get my ideas across absolutely as clearly as possible in a way that does not require the reader to do extra work, because they're reading stacks of applications sometimes, and you don't want them to have to go back and reread a sentence and try to figure out what it meant. So clarity of writing, and that's something, find a friend or a family member who is not an academic and have them read your essays. And if they don't understand any of it, granted, they're not going to understand all of it. Sometimes things are very specific to your field, but if they don't understand any of it, that's a really bad sign. If you send it to me and I don't understand any of it, that's a bad sign. I know nothing about economics, but by the end of the time with the econ people I worked with on NSF this year, I understood their projects. There were lines in there were equations in there that I didn't understand, and I couldn't tell them if they were right, but I did understand the projects because they could write clearly. And then my last point on my tips and tricks is to be positive. So be positive in 2 ways. One is you have to sell yourself. People are so sometimes scared to sell themselves, and they're not used to doing that in their personal lives, and they sort of back away and say, well, of course I can't do all of this that I said I was going to do, or, so you really need to sell yourself. For one thing, everyone else who's applying is selling themselves, so you need to stand out among them. But also, this is really you saying to someone, I am worthy of the funding that you're offering. So you need to do that, but you need to do that without tearing down other people. And this is especially important in fellowship applications because you do not know who's going to read it. And so if you say, no work has ever been done on this topic, and it turns out the person reading it is the person who has done the work on that topic, you're not going to win the fellowship. If you say, the work done on this topic has been horrible, and the person reading it is the one who, developed that theory, that's a bad thing. So you want to frame it as positively as possible. Things like, we have the opportunity to go further. We can build on this knowledge by doing this. And sometimes it's really subtle ways of turning around sentences, but it can go a long way toward putting your reader in a positive frame of mind. So those things are all on my PowerPoint, but I think those are sort of if I were going to tell you the really easy ways to think about applying for a fellowship, the things that seem like they should just be common knowledge, but really aren't when you try to go and write a fellowship application, those are the things that I would point to.
I just wanted to ask something about faculty participation in that I really encourage you to seek feedback from your faculty mentors if you feel like it's appropriate to do so based on your relationship and your discipline and whatnot. I think it's possible that the psychology-related fellowships are maybe a little shorter than some other fields, because I've never seen something that's more than 4 pages probably, so research statements and work from 1 to 4 pages. That said, I've never let any of my students apply to anything that I have in my Bible competitive, and so not let them, I'm sure they could do it, it's just that's not how our working relationship works, and they wouldn't think to apply for something without asking me to read it, and I'm always happy to read it, and so I think that that's really useful to ask faculty for help, and don't do it at the last minute, and maybe some people won't have time, and that's okay too, but you could say, you can email a mentor and say, I'm applying for this thing, would you be willing to read it for me? I can get you a job by X date, it's due that, but I completely understand if, fall's a busy quarter, or it's the holiday season, or whatever it is, give them an out if you want. I think that that's fine too, but I think it really can't hurt to ask, and probably your faculty mentors have applied for just this sort of thing before, or have had former students who have, and that can be really helpful.
I have a piece about audience that I think goes to both of these points is, again, remember who the audience is for the fellowship, and that it may not be people who know much about your field at all, and this point about writing for that audience. So you don't want a 5-line sentence that has a subject at the end, right? And that might be okay for the way that, in fact, we're trained poorly to write, but it's not okay for a fellowship. And it's not okay for proposals generally. And I think it is a really good place to be bold. It's a proposal. Here's what I'm going to do. You don't have done it yet, right? So be bold and be assertive about who you are and what your project is about, and why it's fantastic. But I do think that the thing about audiences, you still have Little Red Schoolhouse? No Little Red Schoolhouse, they changed my life. Like, they changed the way I write sentences. And I thought I was a good writer. But writing is something we work on forever. So there's no shame in getting assistance, and I think you're going to be better off for it. And particularly with this particular genre. We can talk about genre, but it really is a particular genre of writing that doesn't come naturally. So reach out to anyone who can help in that.
I'll also say, definitely send it to faculty members, go to Little Red Schoolhouse and do all that, but also form writing groups with people in your cohort, because right before I came here, I met with the writing group, and the writing group I had when I was writing my NSF is still in some ways, at least partly, the writing group I have now that I'm writing my dissertation, and it's amazing to get the feedback from your advisors, and it's really helpful to get outside readers. But at the end of the day, if you have a really rough first draft and you're not 100% ready to send it to your faculty member, that's where your writing group should come in. That's the point where forming writing relationships with people in your cohort and in your department makes the biggest difference. In my first year, we had a writing group of 5 people working together to put together NSF applications, and 2 of the 5 got the NSF. So I think that it's not just that, like, wow, we had a really great writing group. I think it's that we pushed each other to rewrite and edit and revise drafts until they were really competitive.
And there are people that you can come to in different stages of the draft, right? So you're not going to take your 50% there draft to your advisor, but you can bring that to your friend and colleague. I was just actually on the phone this morning with one of my colleagues who's in anthropology with me here, and we were talking about fellowship estimate today. So, you don't bring that to certain people, right? But you can bring that to other people.
Yeah, and I've definitely had students, so for NSF, I always tell students, you need to give your essays to your faculty member. Even if they're not revising them, you need to at least give them the essays so they know what you said about yourself before, they write their letters. And I've had students not want to apply because they don't want to give these essays to the faculty member. But you're not going to win if you don't think it's good enough for the faculty member to see. But also, it's really important to sort of build that relationship with the faculty member. So this isn't just about helping your application to the fellowship, but this is about building a relationship really early on, continuing that relationship with these faculty members so they understand your project, as it evolves over the years. The faculty members here can correct me if I'm wrong, but I have to think it helps if they have a letter for you already the next time you go to ask for a letter. So, asking for letters early that they can keep revising instead of the first letter you ask for being for the job you're applying for is probably a really positive thing. It can really help you.
And they want you to win too. You have to remember that. That they have an interest in their students doing really well and getting fellowships, and it's kind of like everyone wants you to succeed on this.
So you talked a lot about applying for as much as you can and certainly taking that advice to heart, but are there situations where you really shouldn't be applying? Especially when you feel like a write-up branch, you'd be concerned about maybe if you're on the borderline of being ready, applying too soon, wearing out your faculty members' patience or the decision making of these patients, things that maybe are too tangentially related to your work.
Yeah, that's a good question. The question is, are there times when you really shouldn't apply for various reasons? I know for the dissertation write-up fellowships through the division that we ask for a timeline of how you're going to complete your dissertation, and we ask for that timeline to be signed by your advisor. And we really, really do that for a reason. Some of these fellowships, we have Mellon dissertation fellowships, for instance, and Mellon comes back to us and wants reports. So these people that we funded, did they graduate? How quickly did they graduate? What are they doing? And so we have things set into these fellowships that if you hold them, then you can only get funding from the university for 2 quarters after that, and then you're cut off. And so there are times when, in fact, you should not apply for fellowship.
if you are really not going to finish that dissertation in that year, you probably should not be applying for a dissertation writing fellowship. Now, if you're sort of on the fence and you think if you really pushed yourself you could, I'd say go ahead and apply because you'll get it and you'll have really good incentive to finish. But it is a matter of sort of knowing yourself and knowing your own limitations for timeline and things like that.
Yeah, I definitely advise students not to apply in just that situation where it's something like, hey, if I get this, I really need to finish next year. And it was with I can think of one example where it was with a student. It wasn't that she would have any trouble finishing. She absolutely could be done. It was more sort of a strategic conversation about she might not be ready to go on the job market this year. She stayed another year. She would be. She could go on the postdoc. It was just kind of a question about what opportunities when, and both kind of felt that her having flexibility of staying for an extra year in graduate school, and there were, you know, other grant sources and whatnot that could support her. It just seemed like some flexibility was good in that situation, but that's probably, my guess is those are limited instances where it doesn't make sense to apply.
I think in terms of like the subject area being too tangential, I'm probably not a good person to ask because I'm promiscuous with the way that I apply to things. Like any discipline can try to get it. But I hate that like this point about having your advisor on board is essential because if your advisor's not on board, the letter's not going to match the proposal and it's just a non-starter. So I think it's definitely important to have a conversation about that.
And I think along the lines of sort of strategic timeline stuff, it's important to talk to someone like me or your departmental administrator who sort of understands how the funding works. I have had occasional instances where someone wanted to apply for funding to go abroad. They were going to put their funding from the university on hold, and then when I probe a little deeper, they intend to graduate in 5 years. And the funding to go abroad is not as good as the funding they have from here, and they should really just not do that. They should just take their 5 years of funding from us and graduate. Those sorts of situations are fairly rare in social sciences, because generally people who need to go abroad take more than 5 years to graduate. But that sort of thing does come up occasionally, and so sort of thinking very strategically about, well, should I take this kind of fellowship at this point, or should I just use university funding because I have a very good idea that in my 6th year I'm going to get a dissertation fellowship, and so it's not worthwhile to do this other kind of thing. So there are times when it may not be the best thing to take a certain kind of fellowship, and you can always apply and then make that decision later. You don't have to accept a fellowship that you get. That's something to think about too. I mean, you shouldn't apply for a whole bunch of fellowships you don't intend to get, but if you just really haven't made those kind of decisions yet, you can still apply. So there are very occasionally things like that come up, but I think in general, you know, I wouldn't say you shouldn't apply because your subject matter is too far away. If you think it's even close enough to be thinking about it, then you're probably close enough to be applying, and you need to think strategically about how to write your essays and how to make that case. But it's, you know, a different sort of conversation.
And also, if you can think about ways to, some fellowships can be deferred. If it's a fellowship that can be deferred, then you might as well apply. I just know I'm always try not to get in a situation where my money is about to run out and then you're desperate and frantic, right? So if there's a few that you can apply to, and then maybe have another round that you plan to apply to in the future, I don't see how that can hurt.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about fellowship opportunities for international students, because I know some of the bigger ones like the NSF, and if I'm not mistaken, the Todd as well, the open to American students.
Yeah, so the question is about fellowship opportunities for international students. So let me start by saying Jessica mentioned their fellowships database, and that's one of the filters you can do in the database, is if you're a US citizen or international. So you can find whatever we have in the database right now. And almost all fellowship databases out there are going to let you search by that sort of criteria, so you can figure out what you are eligible for. I will say that fellowships for the early years of graduate school for international students are very, very rare unless you can find them through your home country. So things like NSF and Ford and JobEts and all of those are designed for sort of the first few years of graduate school, and they're almost entirely funded through US government agencies. So that can be very, very difficult to find. When it gets to things like dissertation research fellowships, so there are things, of course, like Fulbright that only US citizens are eligible for, but things, I think the SSRC is open to international. all of the sort of different little grants that you can get, so grants through the area centers on campus or through the Dean of Students office, all of those sorts of things are going to be open to everybody generally. And then by the time you get to dissertation write-up fellowships, they're almost all open to everybody. There's an occasional one that's maybe through the Department of Education or something that won't be, but almost all of the dissertation write-up fellowships are largely open. So I think the trick for international students is figuring out, I can't front-load myself with fellowships, so I have to sort of use university funding, and then I have to be really, really good at applying for a lot once I am eligible. But it can be tricky.
Or do they recognize that in the decision-making process that they couldn't really act on it anyway? So
I don't know about all grants, but I know I was just recently at a conversation with a lot of, my department has a lot of international students, so we talk about this often, and at least the one I ran in the SSRC actually have sort of positively looked upon themselves as foundations that can support international students. So there are occasions where there's two equally good grants and it's a cutoff, like they fund 50 students and they're looking at student number 49 and one is a U.S. citizen and one is not. They're liable to go and award the 50th grant to the non-U.S. citizen on the basis of the fact that they think the U.S. citizen can probably apply for a Fulbright Hays and other kind of funding resources and international students cannot. So they definitely understand that international students have access to the job and so that adds up. And in some cases, and I don't know if this is true for all foundations, but when we were just discussing this for the one I read in the SSRC, they actually try to kind of incorporate that a little bit into the decision-making process, at least when it comes to like borderline cases, to say that we have some responsibility to international students who may not have access to other kinds of resources.
I've also, it's sort of a tricky thing to say about yourself in an application, but I've regularly seen letters of recommendation where the faculty member brings that up, sort of highlights, this is an international student who hasn't had a lot of opportunities for other kinds of fellowships, and so I really encourage you to fund her. And I think in general, it's okay to say to faculty members if there are particular things you want to highlight. The letter is up to them. They're going to write what they're going to write. But if there are particular things that you would like them to mention, I think having a conversation, this isn't something I would just throw in an email and shoot it off to them, but having a conversation with your advisor about that sort of thing, and that you're really concerned that you haven't been able to find other kind of fellowships, and maybe they could highlight that in the letter. I think asking can't hurt. What you're going to write is what you're going to write, though.
Is it possible to get a fellowship twice? Suppose you take a pre-dissertation one and then you apply for a full one. Is that possible? For example, the Nicholson Center for British Studies, I think we ought to go.
Yes, the question is about, can you get a fellowship from the same granting agency twice, essentially different kinds of fellowships, and that's going to just largely depend on the granting agency. So an area center on campus is probably pretty likely to fund you again if they funded you before, because there are only so many people that work on that particular region. And certain things like the Mellon ACLS, they want to fund people that they funded before, but there are other granting agencies that might not. So that's another place where you might want to think ahead and read the descriptions of the fellowships that you may be applying for 5 years from now to see if it's going to hurt you. But I think it's pretty rare that it would hurt you to have had an application or had a fellowship from that funding agency before. All right, well, it is 2:30, so I think we're going to end here. Thank you so much for coming, and a big thank you to our panel.